The pilot saw them first through the oil-streaked canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, a formation of four-engine bombers, still 20 kilometers distant, their silver fuselages catching the morning sun over Bavaria. It was March 21st, 1944, and Oberleutnant Franz Stigler had been flying combat missions against American heavy bombers for 8 months. He knew what to expect. Close rapidly from the rear quarter, exploit the blind spot beneath the tail, fire a concentrated burst into the engines or fuel tanks, then break away before the defensive gunners could track him. He had shot down 3 B-17 flying fortresses using exactly this technique. The B-17 seconds were formidable aircraft, certainly. They carried 1350 caliber machine guns and flew in tight box formations designed to create overlapping fields of fire. But German fighter pilots had developed tactics to counter them. Attack from 12 o'clock high where the nose guns had limited traverse. Come in from 6 o'clock low where the ball turret's line of fire was restricted. Use superior speed to close quickly, fire, and escape before the defensive fire became concentrated. Stigler advanced his throttle and began his attack run. But as he closed to within 5 kilometers, something was different. These weren't B-17 seconds. The fuselages were longer, the wings positioned higher on the body. The tail configuration was distinctive, a twin vertical stabilizer design rather than the single tail of the flying fortress. These were B-24 Liberators. Stigler had heard about them from other pilots, but this was his first encounter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He continued his approach, calculating angles and deflection. The formation held steady, maintaining their bombing run toward the Messerschmitt production facility at Augsburg. Stigler positioned himself for a classic 6 o'clock low attack, the approach that had worked so well against B-17 seconds. He was perhaps 2,000 meters behind the trailing aircraft when the first tracers reached toward him. Then came more. Streams of 50 caliber fire from multiple positions, not just from the tail turret but from waist positions, from the belly, from what appeared to be every angle of the aircraft. The volume of fire was stunning. Stigler broke left, diving away, his aircraft shuddering as several rounds struck his wing. He had never experienced defensive fire of such intensity from a single bomber. On the ground below, in the operations room of Luftwaffe Jagdgeschwader 53, intelligence officers were compiling reports that would fundamentally change German understanding of American bomber capabilities. The B-24 Liberator wasn't just another heavy bomber. It was a flying fortress with firepower that exceeded even the B-17, and the Americans were producing them in quantities that suggested the daylight bombing campaign was about to intensify beyond anything Germany had yet experienced. The question that would haunt German fighter commanders over the coming months was not whether they could shoot down B-24 seconds, it was whether they could sustain the losses required to do so, because each B-24 carried 10 50 caliber machine gun positions, and the Americans had built more than 18,000 of them. To understand why the B-24's defensive armament represented such a shock to German pilots, one must first understand the evolution of German fighter tactics against heavy bombers. When American daylight bombing raids began in earnest in 1942, the Luftwaffe approached the problem with confidence born from years of air combat experience. German fighter doctrine emphasized speed, firepower, and aggressive tactics. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, backbone of the Luftwaffe fighter force, could reach speeds exceeding 600 km per hour. It mounted a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. Later variants added 2 more 20mm cannon in underwing pods. This was devastating firepower designed to destroy enemy aircraft quickly. The fundamental German approach to bomber interception was straightforward. Fighters would attack in swarms, 4 aircraft formations, approaching from angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire. The preferred attack was from 12 o'clock high, diving through the bomber formation with all guns firing, then using speed to escape before defensive gunners could respond effectively. Alternative attacks came from 6 o'clock low, exploiting blind spots in the bomber's defensive coverage. These tactics had proven effective against British bombers during the Battle of Britain and the night bombing campaign. RAF bombers typically carried 4 to 8 machine guns in powered turrets. German fighters could close rapidly, fire concentrated bursts, and break away with acceptable risk. The doctrine worked. German pilots shot down hundreds of British bombers using these methods. When American B-17 flying fortresses began appearing over Europe in 1942, German pilots initially treated them as simply another heavy bomber. This assessment proved costly. The B-17 carried 13 50 caliber machine guns in multiple positions, 2 in the nose, 2 in the dorsal turret, 2 in the ball turret beneath the fuselage, 2 in the tail, 2 at the waist positions, and 1 in the radio room. The defensive firepower was substantially greater than anything German pilots had previously encountered. More importantly, the Americans flew in tight formation boxes specifically designed to create overlapping fields of fire. A fighter attacking one bomber would be exposed to defensive fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. German pilots discovered that casual approaches resulted in damaged aircraft and dead pilots. The Luftwaffe adjusted its tactics accordingly, identifying specific attack angles where defensive fire was less concentrated, developing techniques for rapid closure and breakaway, and emphasizing coordinated attacks that saturated the bomber's defensive capability. By early 1944, German fighter units had developed a reasonable understanding of B-17 vulnerabilities and attack methods that, while dangerous, offered acceptable odds of success. Experienced pilots knew where to attack, how to manage their approach speed, and when to break off. The learning had been expensive, paid for in damaged aircraft and casualties, but German fighter units believed they had adapted to the American daylight bombing threat. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption was. The consolidated B-24 Liberator emerged from a 1938 Army Air Corps requirement for a heavy bomber with greater range, higher speed, and better high-altitude performance than existing designs. The specification called for an aircraft capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs over 3,000 miles at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Consolidated Aircraft Corporation in San Diego, California, approached the challenge with innovative engineering. Chief designer Isaac M. Ladden developed an aircraft around the Davis wing, a high aspect ratio design that provided exceptional lift to drag characteristics. The wing, mounted high on the fuselage, gave the B-24 its distinctive appearance and contributed to its superior range and fuel efficiency compared to other heavy bombers. The prototype XB-24 first flew on December 29, 1939. It demonstrated performance that exceeded Army Air Corps expectations. Maximum speed reached 313 miles per hour. Service ceiling exceeded 30,000 feet. Most importantly, range with a 5,000-pound bomb load exceeded 3,000 miles. These capabilities made the B-24 ideal for long-range strategic bombing missions, but range and speed were only part of the design philosophy. The Army Air Corps had learned from early war reports that heavy bombers operating over hostile territory needed substantial defensive armament. German and British experience demonstrated that unescorted bombers faced devastating losses without adequate defensive firepower. The B-24's designers incorporated this lesson from the beginning. Early production B-24D models, entering service in 1942, carried 10 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. 2 guns in the nose, manually aimed by the bombardier. 2 in a powered dorsal turret positioned behind the cockpit. 2 in a powered ball turret beneath the fuselage, 2 in the tail turret, and 2 at waist positions, 1 on each side of the rear fuselage, manually operated by waist gunners. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was itself a formidable weapon. Designed in the 1920s and perfected through the 1930s. It fired a 12.7 mm projectile at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,900 feet per second. Rate of fire reached 750 to 850 rounds per minute per gun. Each gun position carried between 300 and 600 rounds of ammunition depending on location. The ammunition itself came in several types. ball rounds for general use against aircraft structures, armor-piercing incendiary rounds designed to penetrate armor plate and ignite fuel, tracer rounds for aiming correction. A typical ammunition load mixed these types, usually 4 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, 1 tracer round, in repeating sequence. This combination gave gunners both destructive power and visual feedback for aim correction. The effectiveness of the B-24's defensive armament came not from any single innovation, but from the comprehensive integration of multiple systems designed to create overlapping fields of fire that left virtually no approach. Angle undefended. American engineers had studied combat reports from both British and early American bombing missions to identify where defensive gaps existed and how attacking fighters exploited them. The nose position on early B-24D models consisted of 250 caliber machine guns mounted in flexible sockets operated by the bombardier. These guns could traverse approximately 60 degrees left and right and elevate to cover threats approaching from 12 o'clock high, the classic fighter attack angle. The bombardier, lying prone in the nose compartment with the Norden bomb sight, could quickly transition from bombing duties to defensive gunnery when enemy fighters appeared. The powered turrets represented significant technological achievement. The Martin dorsal turret, positioned just behind the cockpit, rotated 360 degrees and could elevate to nearly vertical. 250 caliber guns fired in unison, controlled by the turret gunner through a computing gun sight that calculated lead angles based on target speed and direction. The turret's electric motors could traverse at 60 degrees per second, fast enough to track most attacking fighters. The Sperry ball turret beneath the fuselage was perhaps the most remarkable defensive position. A spherical housing containing 2 50 caliber guns and a gunner, suspended from the aircraft's belly by a support frame. The gunner, typically the smallest crew member due to space constraints, entered through the fuselage and was then rotated into position. Once sealed inside, he operated in a space barely 4 feet in diameter, surrounded by ammunition feeds, gun mechanisms, and the thin aluminum skin separating him from the outside air at 25,000 feet. The ball turret could rotate 360 degrees and elevate from directly downward to nearly horizontal forward. This gave complete coverage of the lower hemisphere, eliminating the blind spot that German fighters had exploited when attacking B-17 seconds from 6 o'clock low. The Sperry computing sight automatically calculated deflection angles, allowing even relatively inexperienced gunners to achieve effective fire against fast-moving targets. The tail turret provided rearward defense with 250 caliber guns in a powered mounting. The tail gunner, isolated in the rear fuselage, had perhaps the most dangerous position on the aircraft. He faced backwards throughout the mission, watching for fighters approaching from astern. When attacks developed, he was the first line of defense, engaging fighters as they closed from 6 o'clock. The tail turret could traverse approximately 90 degrees horizontally and 60 degrees vertically, covering the entire rear quadrant. The waist positions, one on each side of the rear fuselage, were manually operated by waist gunners. These positions initially had open windows through which the guns fired, exposing gunners to extreme cold and wind at high altitude. Later models enclosed these positions, but the guns remained manually aimed and fired. Waist gunners covered the beam approaches, engaging fighters attacking from 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock. Their fields of fire overlapped with both the dorsal turret and ball turret, creating zones where attacking fighters faced fire from multiple positions simultaneously. Each gun position carried substantial ammunition. The nose guns had approximately 600 rounds per gun. The dorsal turret carried 400 rounds per gun. The ball turret, limited by space constraints, held 580 rounds per gun. The tail turret carried 600 rounds per gun. The waist guns each had 600 rounds. Total defensive ammunition load exceeded 6,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, weighing approximately 400 pounds. The guns themselves were maintained meticulously. Armourers cleaned and inspected each weapon before every mission. They checked headspace and timing, ensuring the guns would fire reliably at altitude, where temperatures could reach -60 degrees Fahrenheit. They loaded ammunition belts, mixing armor-piercing incendiary and tracer rounds in the proper sequence. They tested fire each gun on the ground when possible, verifying function. The first large-scale encounter between German fighters and B-24 formations occurred during the Ploesti raid on August 1, 1943. 177 B-24 seconds launched from bases in Libya to attack Romanian oil refineries that supplied much of Germany's fuel. The mission required flying at extremely low altitude to achieve surprise, negating much of the bomber's defensive advantage. German and Romanian fighters engaged the formations throughout the attack. The results were devastating for both sides. 54 B-24 seconds were lost, most to anti-aircraft fire and collisions with obstacles during the low-level attack. But German fighters claimed several kills. However, Luftwaffe pilots reported something unexpected in their debriefing sessions. The B-24 seconds, even at low altitude where their defensive positions had restricted fields of fire, generated massive volumes of 50 caliber fire. Multiple German fighters returned to base with significant damage. Several pilots were killed or wounded by defensive fire. Hauptmann Werner Schroer, a decorated fighter ace with 114 confirmed victories, filed a combat report after engaging B-24 seconds during the Ploesti mission. He described approaching a damaged bomber that had separated from the formation, intending to finish it with a standard rear quarter attack. As he closed to firing range, he encountered what he described as a wall of tracers from multiple positions on the aircraft. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 took several hits, damaging his engine and forcing him to break off. The bomber, despite visible damage and flying alone, successfully defended itself and limped toward friendly territory. But Ploesti was an anomaly, a low-altitude mission unlike the high-altitude strategic bombing that would characterize the air war over Europe. The true test came during the sustained bombing campaign of late 1943 and early 1944, when B-24 groups joined B-17 groups in massive formations attacking targets deep inside Germany. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched Mission 115 against ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. The force included 291 B-17 seconds and 29 B-24 seconds. German fighters attacked in waves throughout the mission. The Americans lost 60 bombers, most of them B-17 seconds. The B-24 groups, flying slightly different altitudes and routes, reported lower loss rates despite flying through the same defended airspace. Post-mission analysis revealed significant differences in how German fighters approached B-24 seconds versus B-17 seconds. Luftwaffe pilots, experienced in attacking B-17 seconds, initially used their standard tactics against B-24 seconds. They quickly learned these tactics were less effective. The ball turret's complete lower hemisphere coverage eliminated the 6 o'clock low blind spot. The nose guns and dorsal turret created devastating fire zones for frontal attacks. The waist positions, with their broad fields of fire, made beam attacks extremely dangerous. German pilots began developing new tactics specifically for B-24 seconds. Intelligence officers interrogated captured Luftwaffe pilots and compiled their observations. One Unteroffizier, shot down after his Focke-Wulf Favu 190 was damaged, attacking a B-24 formation, described the experience to American interrogators. He had attacked what he thought was a standard heavy bomber formation from 9 o'clock level, the beam approach. As he closed to 400 meters, fire from at least 4 different positions on multiple aircraft converged on his fighter. His engine was hit, his canopy shattered, and he suffered wounds to his left arm and shoulder. He managed to bail out before his aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin. What struck him most, he told interrogators, was the sheer volume of fire. He had attacked B-17 formations many times using similar tactics. The defensive fire from B-17 seconds was substantial but manageable. Experienced pilots learned to minimize their exposure and accept reasonable risk, but the B-24 seconds seemed to fire from every angle simultaneously. The concentration of tracers was unlike anything he had experienced. He stated flatly that he would not attack B-24 formations using beam approaches again. The statistical evidence compiled by both German and American intelligence confirmed what individual pilots were reporting. B-24 formations were more difficult to attack successfully than B-17 formations, and German fighter losses per bomber destroyed were higher when engaging B-24 seconds. 8th Air Force statistical analysis from late 1943 through early 1944 documented this disparity. B-17 groups flying missions during this period experienced loss rates averaging approximately 5% per mission, sometimes higher during particularly intense fighter opposition. B-24 groups flying similar missions to similar targets experienced average loss rates of approximately 3.8%. The difference appeared small in percentage terms, but became significant when calculated across hundreds of missions and thousands of aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German records, captured after the war and analyzed by Allied intelligence, revealed corresponding patterns. Luftwaffe fighter units reported higher ammunition expenditure per B-24 destroyed compared to B-17 seconds. The average fighter required approximately 3 to 4 attack passes to destroy a B-17 flying in formation. Destroying a B-24 inches formation required an average of 5 to 6 passes, exposing the attacking fighter to defensive fire for substantially longer periods. More tellingly, German fighter loss and damage rates increased when engaging B-24 heavy formations. Jagdgeschwader combat logs documented this clearly. During January 1944, Jagdgeschwader 11 engaged American bomber formations on 17 separate occasions. 8 engagements were primarily against B-17 formations. 9 were primarily against B-24 formations. The unit lost 12 aircraft destroyed and 19 damaged during the month. Of the 12 aircraft destroyed, 8 were lost during engagements with B-24 formations. Of the 19 damaged, 13 occurred during B-24 engagements. The disparity became stark when commanders analyzed the data. Their fighters were suffering higher losses despite achieving fewer bomber kills when attacking B-24 seconds. The mathematics were unfavorable. If current trends continued, they would attrite their fighter force faster than they could replace it. The reason lay in the B-24's defensive architecture. The 10 gun positions created overlapping fields of fire that forced attacking fighters to penetrate multiple defensive zones. A fighter attacking from 12 o'clock high faced nose guns, dorsal turret guns, and potentially waist guns if approaching at an angle. A fighter attacking from 6 o'clock faced tail guns, dorsal turret guns, and ball turret guns. A beam attack at 9 o'clock or 3 o'clock exposed the fighter to dorsal turret, ball turret, and waist guns simultaneously. The 50 caliber Browning M2's effective range exceeded 1,000 yards under ideal conditions, though practical combat range was typically 600 to 800 yards, where gunners could accurately track and lead targets. This meant attacking fighters entered the defensive fire zone while still outside their own effective cannon range. German 20mm cannon had maximum effective range of approximately 700 meters against bomber-sized targets. 30mm cannon, introduced on later WWII models, extended this to perhaps 850 meters. But these ranges assumed steady, accurate fire, difficult to achieve while maneuvering violently and surrounded by defensive tracers. German fighter commanders recognized they faced a fundamental problem. The B-24 Liberators' defensive firepower required tactical changes that their pilots, trained and experienced in methods that worked against B-17 seconds, found difficult to implement under combat conditions. The Luftwaffe was fighting a learning war, where each lesson cost aircraft and pilots they could not easily replace. Major Heinz Bahr, a decorated fighter ace commanding Jagdgeschwader 1, issued new tactical directives to his pilots in February 1944. Pilots were instructed to avoid beam attacks entirely unless no other approach was possible. The preferred attack angle shifted to 12 o'clock high, diving through the formation at maximum speed to minimize exposure time. Alternatively, pilots should attack from 6 o'clock high, using altitude advantage to engage briefly before breaking away upward out of the ball turret's field of fire. These tactics reduced German losses but also reduced effectiveness. High-speed diving attacks gave pilots only seconds to aim and fire. The closure rate exceeded 500 miles per hour when combining the fighter's speed with the bomber's forward motion. Accurate gunnery under such conditions required exceptional skill. Most attacks resulted in misses or minor damage rather than catastrophic hits. The alternative approach, 6 o'clock high, forced fighters to attack through concentrated fire from tail guns and dorsal turrets, often from multiple bombers simultaneously, as formations maintained tight defensive boxes. Some German fighter units experimented with standoff weapons to avoid close engagement entirely. The Werfer Granat 21, a rocket mortar launched from tubes beneath the fighter's wings, could engage bomber formations from beyond defensive gun range. Each rocket contained 110 pounds of high explosive, fitted with a time fuse. Pilots fired salvos into the bomber formations, hoping for proximity detonations that would damage or destroy aircraft. The system proved largely ineffective. The rockets were inaccurate, their ballistic trajectory difficult to calculate under combat conditions. American bomber formations learned to break their tight boxes when they detected rocket launches, dispersing before the rockets arrived. Of thousands of rockets fired, only a handful of bombers were destroyed. The rockets added weight and drag to the fighters, reducing their performance during subsequent conventional attacks. Most fighter units abandoned the system after limited trials. The more effective German response was to concentrate overwhelming force against specific bomber formations. Rather than dispersing fighters across multiple attack axes, Luftwaffe controllers directed entire Jagdgeschwader against single bomber groups. 50 to 80 fighters attacking simultaneously could saturate even the B-24's formidable defensive fire, achieving kills before the bomber's mutual support could be fully effective. But this tactic required precise coordination, radar guidance to intercept the formations, and sufficient fighters to generate the necessary mass. As the air war progressed into mid-1944, the Luftwaffe increasingly lacked all three requirements. German fighter production actually increased during 1944. Messerschmitt factories produced thousands of Bf-109G models. Focke-Wulf plants built Fof-190A models in substantial numbers. But production could not overcome pilot losses. Experienced fighter pilots, men with years of combat experience and dozens of kills, were being shot down faster than training schools could replace them. New pilots arrived at operational units with perhaps 150 hours of flight time, compared to 300 or more hours for pilots who had entered service in 1942. These inexperienced pilots faced American bomber formations, defended by 10-50 caliber guns per aircraft, flying in boxes of 18 to 27 bombers that created overlapping defensive fire, encompassing hundreds of guns. The new pilots died quickly, often on their first or second missions. By spring 1944, the average German fighter pilot's life expectancy after reaching an operational unit was measured in weeks. The B-24's contribution to this attrition was substantial, but not immediately obvious in combat. Reports: the aircraft didn't generate dramatic ace-killing ace moments. Instead, it steadily damaged attacking fighters, forcing them to break off, degrading their effectiveness, and occasionally achieving kills when damaged fighters couldn't return to base. Over hundreds of missions involving thousands of B-24 seconds, this cumulative effect eroded German fighter capabilities. The broader context of B-24 production revealed the true impossibility of Germany's strategic position. While Luftwaffe pilots struggled to develop tactics against American heavy bombers, American factories produced those bombers in quantities that rendered individual tactical victories meaningless. The industrial disparity between the United States and Germany was so vast that the outcome was predetermined regardless of tactical innovation or pilot courage. Consolidated Aircraft operated 5 production facilities, building B-24 seconds. The main plant in San Diego, California, where the design originated, produced aircraft steadily throughout the war. Ford Motor Company built the massive Willow Run plant in Michigan specifically for B-24 production. This facility, designed by Albert Kahn, and funded by the US government, was the largest manufacturing building in the world when completed in 1942. The main assembly building covered 67 acres under one roof. The assembly line stretched more than 1 mile. At peak production in 1944, Willow Run produced one complete B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Workers, many of them women who had never worked in manufacturing before the war, assembled aircraft using mass production techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing. The plant employed 42,000 workers across multiple shifts, operating 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. North American Aviation in Dallas, Texas, Douglas Aircraft in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Consolidated's Fort Worth, Texas plant also produced B-24 seconds under license. These facilities added thousands more aircraft to the production total. The entire B-24 production system represented an industrial mobilization unprecedented in human history. From first flight in December 1939 to final production in May 1945, American factories built 18,482 B-24 Liberators. This made it the most produced American military aircraft of World War II, exceeding even the B-17 Flying Fortress. Production peaked in 1944 when factories delivered 8,000 B-24 seconds, an average of more than 20 aircraft per day throughout the entire year. Each B-24 required approximately 450,000 individual parts. The supply chain delivering these components involved thousands of subcontractors across the United States. Engines came from Pratt & Whitney or General Motors, propellers from Hamilton Standard or Curtiss, instruments from Bendix and Colesman, weapons from Colt and Browning, tires from Goodyear and Firestone, radio equipment from dozens of electronics manufacturers. The organizational complexity rivaled the aircraft's technical complexity. Germany could not match this production capacity. Total German 4-engine heavy bomber production from 1939 through 1945 numbered fewer than 2,000 aircraft, including multiple types that never reached operational status. Germany produced excellent twin-engine medium bombers, like the Junkers Ju-88 and Heinkel He 111 in substantial numbers, but these lacked the range, bomb load, and defensive armament of American heavy bombers. More critically, Germany's aircraft production focused heavily on fighters to defend against Allied bombing. Messerschmitt Bf 109 production exceeded 33,000 aircraft. Focke-Wulf Fu-190 production reached more than 20,000. These fighters were necessary for homeland defense, but their production consumed resources that might otherwise have gone to bomber development or other military needs. The strategic implications were clear. Germany was fighting a defensive war in the air, attempting to destroy enough Allied bombers to make the bombing campaign unsustainable. The United States was fighting an offensive war, producing bombers faster than Germany could destroy them, while simultaneously producing fighters to escort those bombers. The mathematics favored the side with greater industrial capacity. In late 1943 and early 1944, American P-51 Mustang fighters began escorting bomber formations deep into Germany, further tilting the balance. German pilots attacking B-24 formations in early 1944 faced not only the bombers' defensive firepower, but also escorting fighters that could outperform their Bf-109s and Fo-190s at the altitudes where bomber combat occurred. A pilot who survived defensive fire from the B-24 seconds then had to survive combat with American fighters during withdrawal. The cumulative risk became unacceptable. Luftwaffe loss rates climbed throughout 1944. During Big Week in February, a concentrated series of bombing missions against German aircraft production facilities, the Luftwaffe lost more than 300 fighters in 6 days of intensive combat. Many of these losses occurred during attacks on B-24 formations. The German fighter force never fully recovered. By June 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, the Luftwaffe could barely contest Allied air superiority over France. The B-24 Liberator flew more than 200,000 combat sorties during World War II. It dropped more than 635,000 tons of bombs on Axis targets. 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force B-24 groups attacked oil refineries, aircraft factories, transportation infrastructure, and military installations across occupied Europe and Germany. The aircraft served in every theatre of war, from Europe to the Pacific to the Mediterranean to the China-Burma-India theatre. But the B-24's most significant contribution was perhaps not the bombs it dropped, but the industrial and tactical reality it represented. Each B-24 inches formation over Germany was physical proof of American production capacity. Each bomber carried 10 50-caliber machine guns, 6,000 rounds of ammunition, a crew of 10 men who had been trained at tremendous expense, fuel refined from American oil fields, bombs manufactured in American factories, and represented an investment of approximately $300,000 in 1944 currency. The Germans who faced these formations understood what they represented. They were not fighting individual aircraft. They were fighting an industrial system that could replace losses faster than those losses could be inflicted. They were fighting an economy that could train crews, produce aircraft, manufacture ammunition, and sustain operations across multiple theatres simultaneously. They were fighting a nation whose productive capacity exceeded the combined capacity of all Axis powers. For the Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war, the memory of attacking B-24 formations remained vivid decades later. Many described a specific moment of realization, not during any single dramatic battle but gradually over weeks and months of combat, when they understood they could not win. The understanding came from cumulative experience. Another mission where the bombers kept coming despite losses. Another engagement where defensive fire damaged your aircraft. Another day when replacement aircraft arrived in your unit, bearing unfamiliar faces because the experienced pilots were dead. Franz Stigler, the pilot who encountered his first B-24 seconds over Bavaria in March 1944, survived the war with 28 confirmed victories. In post-war interviews, he described the progression of his understanding. Early in his combat career, he believed German pilots could defeat the American bombing campaign through skill and determination. After months of combat against B-24 and B-17 formations, he realized individual skill mattered far less than industrial capacity and numerical superiority. By war's end, he understood that Germany had lost the air war not through any failure of courage or tactical error, but through simple arithmetic. The Americans had more of everything, and no amount of bravery could overcome that disadvantage. The 10 50-caliber machine gun positions on each B-24 were not revolutionary technology. The Browning M2 had been designed 20 years before the bomber entered service. The powered turrets used electric motors and mechanical linkages that were well understood. The computing gun sights applied known principles of ballistics and trigonometry. Nothing about the B-24's defensive armament was beyond German technical capability to produce. What Germany lacked was not knowledge, but capacity. The ability to produce 18,000 heavy bombers while simultaneously producing fighters, tanks, submarines, artillery, and all the other weapons required for global war exceeded German industrial potential. The United States possessed this capacity and used it to overwhelm Axis forces through material superiority. The B-24 crews who flew these missions experienced their own revelations, though of different character than German pilots. American air crews discovered that even with 10 50-caliber guns, even flying in tight defensive formations, they were not invulnerable. German fighters could and did shoot down B-24 seconds. Flak could and did destroy them. Thousands of American airmen died aboard B-24 seconds over Europe. The survival rate for bomber crews completing a full tour of 25 missions in 1943 was approximately 25%. But crews also learned that their defensive firepower worked. Gunners who had trained for months on ground ranges discovered their weapons could drive off, attacking fighters, could damage and destroy them, could protect their aircraft and their crewmates. The confidence this created sustained morale through desperate missions deep into Germany, where losses sometimes exceeded 10% of the attacking force. The story that began with a German pilot encountering his first B-24 formation ended not with any single dramatic moment, but with the gradual grinding victory of industrial warfare. The B-24's 1050 caliber positions were one small part of a massive military machine. Individually, they were simply guns in turrets. Collectively, across thousands of aircraft flying hundreds of thousands of sorties, they represented the application of American industrial might to the problem of strategic bombing. German pilots who had confidently engaged Allied bombers in 1942 found themselves, by 1944, overwhelmed by numbers and firepower they could not match. The terror they felt was not the fear of any individual weapon, but the realization that they faced an opponent whose resources were effectively unlimited. Each B-24 destroyed was replaced by two more. Each mission flown depleted irreplaceable German pilots, while American training schools graduated thousands of new crew members. The war had become unwinnable, and everyone involved knew it. The mathematics that doomed Germany were visible in every combat report. 1050 caliber positions per B-24, 18,000 B-24 seconds produced, 180,000 defensive gun positions flying missions across 3 years of war. The numbers were overwhelming, not because any individual number was impressive, but because the aggregate represented industrial capacity beyond anything Germany could counter. By the time German pilots learned to fear those 10 gun positions on each B-24, it was far too late to matter. The outcome had been determined the moment American factories began producing bombers faster than German fighters could destroy them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.